an attack on Iran's economic infrastructure is possible. It has very weak water infrastructure, and its ports, which are responsible for the export of its oil, its main lifeblood, are also extremely vulnerable.
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battle Lines. It's Wednesday, October 2nd.
We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent.
President Zelensky has for the first time acknowledged that his forces are conducting a cross-border offensive inside Russia.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
We're bringing you another special episode outside of our normal Friday publishing schedule to cover the fast-evolving situation in the Middle East. When we last spoke to you on Monday, we analysed the assassination of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. Later that day, Israel officially invaded Lebanon. Then yesterday, Tuesday, Iran launched 180 missiles at Israel. One person was killed and several injured. Today, we'll be discussing Israel's invasion of Lebanon, Iran's attack, and how Israel might respond. Welcome to Battle Lines. I'm joined by Adrian Blomfield, who's just left Lebanon and is now back in his hometown, Nairobi, and Paul Nuki in Israel, Tel Aviv. Paul, let's start with you. You had a pretty mad day yesterday, which you've written for us and is up on the Telegraph website now. Can you start by breaking down what happened? It was a very busy day.
It was a very busy day. It started about 2 in the morning when I got a call to say that Israel had launched a ground incursion into Lebanon. Something that had been long awaited, but no one was quite sure if it would really happen. Very much part of the escalatory ladder that started 2 weeks ago with those pager explosions and the attack on Hezbollah. So I was up for that. I then raced up to the north of Israel in a taxi in the morning for a briefing with the IDF. We were narrowly missed by a missile on our way up to the north. That was fired not from Iran, but from Lebanon. We then raced back to Tel Aviv. I got a call halfway down the motorway to say that ballistic missiles were on their way from Iran. And as we pulled up in Jaffa, where my hotel is in Tel Aviv, this shooting broke out with 6 people being killed by 2 shooters from Hebron in the West Bank. So it was an exciting day, but also quite a scary one.
So a lot been going on in Israel, and for a country that has incredible air defences, clearly some stuff has been getting through, both from Hezbollah and from Iran. Let's drill into the Iran attack, because obviously that's the big news from last night. Can you give us some more details about what missiles were used, how much warning Israel had, and how did Israel manage to intercept, we think most but not all, of the missiles that were coming over?
It's interesting. When I got told that the missiles were on their way, the person who told me said, well, look, you've got an hour to get yourself to a shelter because that's how long they'll take once we know they've been fired. But they came much quicker. And that's because they are thought to have been this Fatah 1 hypersonic missile. So traveling much faster than a normal ballistic missile. And they really got here very quickly. I was in, by that time, a basement, a bomb shelter, but watching on something like a live feed. You could see the missiles arching up over Jerusalem, heading towards Tel Aviv and the south of Israel. Quite a spectacular show. You will have seen it on various videos. And there is no doubt at all that some of these missiles got through. There are extensive video showing missiles landing in the south of Israel around what seem to be air bases. So it's a little bit unclear. I mean, we've got to remember, we're in Israel, it's at war, and it has a military censor. So they don't make public all of the hits that they take. So, for example, we know this morning that there were ambulances and helicopters seemingly taking troops out of Lebanon. So we may see that a little later in the day.
What was the death toll in the end?
So a Palestinian, I believe, died in the West Bank from the missiles fired from Iran. Terrible irony there. And then at least 6 Israelis died in the shooting in Tel Aviv.
And what do we know about the US and UK involvement in trying to stave off the Iranian attack?
It's not very clear. Initially, it was reported that Israel had done all the work. Today, there are reports saying that America was instrumental in shooting down some of the missiles, but we're not clear how many. In April, when this happened, there was quite an alliance led by the American control based in the Gulf, but involving France, the UK, Jordan, Saudi, etc., etc. But it's not clear this time how things have broken down. I would be surprised if the Americans haven't played a major role.
And I can see just some reporting from the last hour that the Defence Secretary John Healey said that the British forces had played their part and that the BBC understands that involved fighter jets, just as in the attack in April, like you were just talking about. What was the mood like when you were in the bomb shelter? It was very eerie watching live news from Israel, people being interviewed. You could hear sirens in the background, explosions of interceptions, possibly things hitting the ground. What was the mood like?
There's a funny psychology with this. As I said, I'm in Jaffa, which is the part of Tel Aviv that was hit with this gun attack. So just a couple of 100 meters from the hotel. And that happened just moments before this missile attack. And that is the thing that really frightens people, frightened me. You're not sure if the knock on the door to tell you to get into the bomb shelter was a gunman. So that's the thing that really frightens, I think. The missiles people are quite used to here. You're in a bomb shelter. People are obviously not happy, but there isn't a palpable sense of fear. And I think it's something quite human. We're not very good, I think, at understanding the lottery of that fear. If you're hearing gunshots in your vicinity and seeing pictures of bodies on the streets, very immediate. 150 ballistic missiles fired in your direction. The chances are they're not going to get you. So people are quite philosophical about that. And in a way, I do worry about that because they may not get you, but they're getting other people or potentially doing so. And certainly you don't want to be living in societies where missiles are being thrown this way and that.
Adrian, I want to bring you in here. What do we know so far about Israel's ground invasion of Lebanon? They've described it as targeted and limited. Does that seem to be supported by the facts on the ground? And what have you heard about what's been going on?
It certainly seems to be more limited at the moment than in 2006. But of course, it's early days yet. The Israelis initially saying that they were only going within walking distance of the border. So far, it's unclear. The fog of war has very much descended in southern Lebanon, so there's lots that is unclear. Hezbollah are saying that they have twice engaged Israeli forces, pushing them out of one village and engaging near another, as well as firing, and I think this is true, that they fired over 100 rockets across the border in recent hours. What we have seen, though, is renewed Israeli bombardment in South Beirut and renewed Israeli warnings to villages. So I think it's now 40 villages south of the Litani River, which was the northern perimeter of the buffer zone in the 2006 war, telling people to actually move further north to a river beyond Sidon. So that's 25 villages were warned today. 5 had already received those warnings. That's caused a lot of panic. And some of those are Christian villages, so people who thought that they would be not involved in this, and they've had the choice of either trying to get beyond the Litani, but that's quite a dangerous journey. And speaking to people earlier in the war, they talked about bombs being in front of them and behind them. So most of them have gone to Ramesh, which is an interesting Christian border town, because earlier in the sort of winter, late winter, early spring, that was where Christians had a confrontation with Hezbollah when it was firing rockets across the border. They rang the church bell, the monastery bell, to alert the village, and they drove Hezbollah out. And it's to there that Israel has told people in that area to go. So there are hundreds of people now taking shelter in the Lady of the Annunciation monastery in Ramesh. Others have gone where they can. So certainly a lot of panic. And of course, I left yesterday afternoon, but yesterday again I was speaking to people who are again continuing to sleep in their cars in Beirut. The Lebanese health ministry has talked about potentially 1 million people being on the move. People have been going across the border to Syria. We have to remember that the Lebanese population, a quarter of them, perhaps 1 million people or more than that, are Syrian refugees. And they're the ones who are really struggling because they've got no support networks at all. And so when we spoke to them, they were sleeping with families in squares, and they've been sleeping rough for days with their babies. We saw some with 8-month-old babies struggling to get nappies, struggling to get formula, really struggling. So the humanitarian situation continues to remain very grave in Lebanon. And more people have been killed. We have to remember with Lebanese figures that they don't distinguish between fighters and civilians. We know that women and children have been killed. I believe that the ministry said 88 people were killed yesterday.
What do you think Israel's sort of medium-term aim is here? We can see that things are clearly still ramping up. We're getting reports in the last few hours of close-range encounters between Israeli military and Hezbollah fighters, and I can see that Israel has mobilised its 98th Division of combat-proven airborne troops, which have been fighting Hamas for months in Gaza, and activated further reservists. So clearly they're pulling more resources up north. What do you think is the strategy here?
Yes, so certainly, I mean, we know what the overall aim is because that was made one of the goals of the war, which is the return of the 60,000 Israeli residents who have been forced out of their homes in northern Israel. And the only way that can happen is if Hezbollah is sufficiently degraded. And one of the things that is interesting in comparison with what we saw in 2006 is that to a certain extent it is possible that Hezbollah fighters on the ground are now fighting in the dark, because those airstrikes, the targeted assassinations, we had the killing of Ibrahim Keel, the head of the Radwan brigades, along with a lot of the senior leaders. So those would have been the ones who would have planned any incursion, because their raison d'etre is to infiltrate Lebanon. You also had the death of Ali Karaki, who was the commander of the Southern Front. And then the mid-level commanders would have been the ones carrying pages, and a lot of them have been incapacitated. So you still have a lot of fighters. Nasrallah claimed to have 100,000 fighters. That seems to be an exaggeration, but there were possibly 20,000 fighters. So you would still have a lot of those, but potentially fairly leaderless and struggling to communicate. But the question is, yes, at what point do you say, well, we've done enough? And that the answer is when Hezbollah stops and looks sufficiently deterred. And we're certainly not there yet. So we're seeing those initial stages, but we're also clearly seeing, I think, that Israel is preparing for a bigger incursion if it judges that it has not yet sufficiently deterred Hezbollah.
I think it's important to distinguish between political and military objectives. So absolutely, the political objective is to get these residents back to the north. But if you talk to the military people or retired military people or military people in the defense establishment of Israel, they are quite concerned that explicit military objectives have not been set, because it does allow for slippage. At the briefing yesterday, for example, the special forces people were saying that they didn't engage any Radwan troops at all on the ground while blowing up all this infrastructure a kilometre or two into Lebanon over the last 10 months. And that's because they believed that they had all fallen back to a second line of defence. So that's 10,000 or more of these elite Radwan troops alone that appear to have survived. And I think for Israel to really stop the missiles going over and keeping this community away, it's going to have to create a buffer zone, and it's going to have to police it. And even then, it may be difficult to stop troops firing missiles over the top. And I think you've got to ask yourself ultimately is how many missiles does it take a month to keep a family away from their community in northern Israel? And my guess is it actually takes very few.
Paul, can you tell us a bit more about that IDF briefing, about what they've been discovering in their various cross-border raids over the last 10 months? Because they had quite a few sort of visual props as well to show off, didn't they?
They did. I mean, they showed off a lot of equipment that they had seized. I'm no expert on military equipment, but I mean, there were clearly IEDs of all sorts, including IEDs. These are improvised explosive devices disguised as rocks. There were anti-personnel weapons, which looked really quite dangerous, full of shrapnel and designed to take out troops. And then quite sophisticated anti-tank weapons. These are the weapons that Hezbollah is not using against tanks, actually, at the start of this conflict, but using against communities. They're just firing these anti-tank weapons from a launcher into these communities. And then there was a lot of communications gear and the rest of it. But most spectacularly, if you like, was the footage of the tunnels. These are big tunnels, very much like we've seen in Gaza, tunnels running hundreds of meters, rooms to sleep in, rooms to cook in, backpacks packed and lined up and ready to go. So you can wander in as a fighter, looking like a civilian, and pop out 10 minutes later with all the kit on and all the weaponry you need. So quite sophisticated, well, attack tunnels if you take the Israelis' view, or defense tunnels if you take Hezbollah's view, but quite sophisticated, built over at least 10 years, some of them, and some of them still being built now.
And I just want to remind our listeners that while all of this is going on, the war in Gaza is still very much active. Things don't seem to be winding down there. Paul, can you give us a brief update about what's been happening there?
The war in Gaza has not gone away. The hunt for Sinwar continues. And every day we see out of Gaza, from the Hamas-dominated health ministry, admittedly, but we see more and more deaths reported. And the WHO, the UN and others continue to report a humanitarian catastrophe. People are living in the most appalling conditions. It's hot, it's dirty, there's all sorts of disease doing the rounds, scabies and the rest of it. There are no schools open for children. And although headlines about starvation have faded and there is food enough going in to prevent that, there is really very little food, and certainly not what you would call a balanced diet.
Yeah, I can see that in the last 24 hours there was a incursion into a village around Khan Yunis, which the Hamas-run health ministry is claiming killed at least 50 people. Israel says that they were attacking a school that Hamas was using as an operating compound. All of which to say is that this conflict, which started as not something simple, but at least between two sides, has now ballooned and has so many different fronts. We have Iran, we have Lebanon, we have Gaza, we have the West Bank, we have Yemen to an extent, Syria. Where do you guys think this is going next? Israel has promised to respond to the Iranian rocket attack. What do you think they might be considering? What are the likely options for the next few days?
Well, yes, I mean, I think that this is where lots of people have been fearing this would go. There had always been these warnings that a war with Hamas could turn into a war with Hezbollah, which would turn into a war with Iran. Last time we were speaking, Paul talked about the ladder of escalation, and we've certainly seen that. Obviously, my ability to tell the future is as limited as anybody's, but I think there'll be three potential options. In April, we saw Israel retaliating. They were told to take the win by the Americans, and they listened. And they carried out a symbolic strike against Iran, but it was a powerfully symbolic strike because it was taking out some of the defenses around the Natanz nuclear facilities, which was designed to show we can strike your nuclear facilities, your missile defenses, we are able to overcome them. The chances of such a limited response now look much smaller. I mean, the situation has changed in two areas, and this, for Netanyahu, he's probably feeling there's a golden opportunity for two reasons. First of all, that insurance policy of Iran in the form of Hezbollah has been severely degraded. So Hezbollah's main purpose as a proxy, or the reason why it had these sophisticated missiles provided by Iran, was to launch a strike at Israeli cities if Israel attacked Iran's nuclear program. Hezbollah does not seem to be in a position to do that. It can still fire its short-range rockets, but it's struggling, or it appears to be struggling, to fire its long-range, sophisticated guided missiles. And the second reason is the American election coming up in a few weeks' time. If Trump wins, huge support Netanyahu, but the Democrats don't want to look like they're anti-Israel in the run-up to the campaign. So if Netanyahu wants to take launch a bigger response than he can. And I think there are two options. Paul will have a better view because he's being briefed by the Israelis, but I'd say there are two options. One is to escalate short of Iran's nuclear program, and that's to strike military bases, the bases where these missiles were launched, and possibly economic targets, ports, etc., which would further do damage to an economy that's already on its knees, in part because of sanctions, in part because of domestic issues. And then the third, literally the nuclear option, is to go after those facilities. But that's also quite dangerous. It may be too late to eliminate that Iran's nuclear capability. It is also very deeply protected. Apart from the missile defense system, a lot of it is underground. You've also got the know-how now. The Iranians know how to make this. So even if you get rid of it, they could come back and try and repair it further down the line. So they already have the know-how. How would such an attack happen? I mean, that's also difficult to predict because probably not going to be enough by missiles alone. But we would also believe that there's serious intelligence penetration in Iran as well, just of the same kind that we saw in Lebanon with Hezbollah. And of course, we have seen Israel launching technological surprises before. You may remember the Stuxnet virus that set back Iran's nuclear program by at least a year when it unleashed a virus about, I think that must be 10, 12 years ago. So I'm sure we could see some surprises on the technical front if that happens, maybe a combination. But those are the options. I'm not going to hazard a guess as to what the Israeli war cabinet will go for. Maybe Paul will.
I would say, for a start, as you have, Adrian, that it is very different from April. I was here then for the big barrage that came in from Iran. And it was very clear after that America had taken a big role in shooting it down and was insisting that any response was very limited. This time, neither of those two things are clear. America has played some role, but it's not bigging it up in taking the missiles down. And it's not talking Israel down. America said there should be a response. It's not contradicting Netanyahu, who's sounding pretty warlike, saying that there's going to be a big response. What it might be, I'm not sure. I've been told before by people in Israel who have some knowledge that an attack on Iran's economic infrastructure is possible. It has very weak water infrastructure, and its ports, which are responsible for the export of its oil, its main lifeblood, are also extremely vulnerable. But Israeli and Western interests over Iran, it seems to me, don't strictly align. Israel faces something close to an existential threat from Iran, and so is very keen to hit it hard. The West doesn't face that threat and worries enormously, I think, about an Iran collapsing into chaos and terror, and perhaps also a collapse of Iran sparking the fury of China and Russia, who are huge trading partners with it. So it's not a simple equation by any means. I think probably less like Lebanon, the US probably has more influence over what Israel does with Iran, simply because Israel depends to some extent on American defenses.
Paul, what do you think of assessments from some parts of Israeli society that Netanyahu has been engineering a way to get into this sort of situation, looking for a casus belli in order to do what would be his greatest legacy, take on Iran and bring down its nuclear ambitions?
Gosh, I mean, the man's motivation is never good to speculate what's going on in people's heads because you never know. But people do have all sorts of views. I don't see it as a great strategic plan. I think that Netanyahu is a master tactician, a master opportunist, and a master brinksman. And that's where he is now. He has moved the political attention of Israel a long way from Gaza on the anniversary of October 7. That politically is hugely important for him. It's allowed him to move upwards in the polls. He's seen by people in Israel as taking the fight to the enemy and no longer the person who was in charge during Israel's worst security disaster. So that's certainly true. Whether it figures in his thinking, I've no idea. And I think also and the Israeli defense establishment, not surprisingly in many ways, focus on military strategy. And they do that rigorously and rather singularly. And they don't focus on a strategy for peace, which is something separate. And I think if you are on that single ladder, that single escalatory ladder, it has a logic that goes to Iran. But whether or not it has a logic that brings peace and you chop off the head of the beast, as people are likely to say here, and all will be good again, well, I'd rather doubt that.
Adrian, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, two things. One brief one, and I think that's just looking at the Americans who have clearly moved from a situation where they're trying to prevent the conflict to trying to manage it. So they will be trying to give some kind of shape to it. And I think the second thing, just to touch on briefly, is the reaction of the Shia street, because this is the reason. There's the main reason why Iran fired these missiles was to assuage growing discontent among the Shias. And of course, we saw lots of celebration, cries of Allahu Akbar, God is great, from the rooftops of Tehran, to Shias firing their weapons into the air in Beirut. Shias in the Middle East, many of them were hoping for some kind of shock and awe. They believed this was shock and awe. The Israelis would not have been shocked or awed, I don't think. But this is probably not going to be enough in the long run. I was very struck by something that Masoud Pezeshkian, the Iranian president, said when in the justification that he gave. And of course, he represents the moderate faction. He was certainly opposed to this, but the decision was made by the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. But Pezeshkian said that Iran has a right to self-defense. And of course, when you're looking at that from the outside, you'd say, well, hang on, Israel hasn't attacked Iran. But for Iran, Lebanon is a vassal state. It looks on the Shia crescent, as we used to call it, Iraq, which emerged and helped to make Iran stronger after the toppling of Saddam Hussein. Obviously, constituents in Lebanon, in Syria, in Bahrain, and in parts of Yemen. So they will feel that they have done something to assuage anger. But in the long run, this is something that essentially looks impotent because of the lack of damage that it did. So it was something on a big scale without really achieving very much. And it's going to be interesting to see. And I think we've talked about this before. I don't think that Iran is going to be able to recover its position in the long run. I think we've seen the high water mark, potentially, of Iranian influence in the Middle East.
We'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me, Adrian Blomfield, now in Nairobi, and Paul Nuki in Tel Aviv. That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from the Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to the Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Degahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.